Welcome to Not Factory Approved, episode 88C, where I continue the reassembly of the Hydramatic transmission. This is actually part of a rebuilding process. This is now, I'm not going to admit how many times I've had this transmission apart. Things are looking good this time. So hopefully this helps as you follow my misadventures.
Rear drum. The front drum has a thrust washer on that side in by the oil delivery sleeve, and it has a thrust washer up the front. So what I've done is that this was all being pushed back. So I put a thinner thrust washer in there and a thicker thrust washer in the back. I knew it was going back too far because I couldn't get the socket in once everything was bolted up. So let's try that and see if it's binding things. I think that's what was happening before, because there was absolutely no clearance on this hub at the back once everything was bolted up, even loosely. Took me a while, but I finally figured it out. I put these two brackets together, drilled 2 holes in each of these, and 1 more hole in the middle at the back. And then I can spread it out diagonally across the transmission. I can lock it in place with the bolt on the back there. And now I can rotate it and not have the shaft get bound up inside that hole and potentially getting bent. So I changed the orientation. I drilled a couple new holes for these brackets. And it's a little more balanced now than it was. So I might actually have to change that again, because once I put the tail shaft on, it's going to be very heavy on one side. But for now, I'll try that. And it seems to be pretty stable. If that's a problem, I will use the lift hole that's on the back, and I'll make a bracket that goes to the back plate, just to hold it more stable, but I don't think I'm going to need that. With the front hub, I said that it was sticking here, which it was, and technically these are not supposed to move once they're in place. It's actually the inner piston that moves, but should it move at all, then if it's not free, it's going to get jammed in one position, which then is going to put pressure on the friction plates. So that's actually why I wanted to make sure that it moved freely. So I'm just going to check the wave of the plates, make sure I didn't mix them up when I put it together, and then put everything back together. Try and figure out why the primary shaft appears to be bent, although I'm not measuring any bend in it. So when I put it all together, it's still binding. If I leave the bolts loose, everything rotates freely. As soon as I tighten up either this flange or the back housing, it starts to get tight. So with the gasket there, see how much distance we got. Okay, so there's back, here's fully forward. The thickness of the gasket, 4.2315. See what we have over here. I'll lock it in place. And up to that there, we have quite a bit of play, which means that it's pushing everything tight. So let's try the minimum. This thing sitting back, which is not going to sit like that anyway, because it has to be even on the housing. Okay. 41560. See how that fits. That's got a bit of clearance there. So it should have the range not to bind that. So I either have well over 4.23 this way, or I have more than 4.15 that way. So I wouldn't think it would be that tight. So it may still be binding. Well, let's check the gasket. Maybe that's fine. I think the mystery has been solved. Right now, if I rotate the front, it spins quite easily. I haven't done these up yet, so that's the deciding factor, but I'm not expecting a problem. It appears to have been that when I was putting this in, the drum was sliding forward and exposing one friction plate inside, which would then drop down and stop the inner hub from engaging completely. So it's pushing against the friction plate. So what I did was I put a spacer in here temporarily, just to stop it sliding forward. And I meshed this in place, and all seems to be okay. In the manual, they say to put the friction plates in from the top side, or the front side, with the inner hub completely installed. You're supposed to have a special tool that is just a little bracket that holds the inner hub in place, and then you don't get that problem. I haven't had that problem in the past. This is the first time I've come across it, so it is possible to do it without putting it in first and putting it in later when it's in the vise and you finish compressing the front piston assembly and putting the ring in. So far that seems to be the case. So I'll torque these all up. The reverse plate holder to these 5 bolts, and then these 5 hold the tail housing on. So everything has to be torqued up, and then I'll see if it still rotates. So far things are looking good. Turns easily. So I just have these left to torque up. I've done these up to 40, these up to 30, or sorry, 35, 30. Now I'm going to do these up to 200 inch-pounds. I'll just use a screwdriver as a block, so I have something to torque against. Do it up in stages, and not sequentially, like not one after the other, but with doing alternates, so it torques up evenly, not crooked. Nobody likes a crook. So far, so good. Now I can do each one. Just go around, make sure they're all at 200. And the spec for this is 13 to 15 foot-pounds. Check my math. Sometimes I say multiplication results quite confidently, and I'm wrong. And now I'm talking and I've lost count. There. Do one more just to make sure. There we go. So, inner shaft turns easily, intermediate shaft turns easily, and what I can grab of the tail shaft, it turns easily. So I think we have a success. It was just one friction plate had dropped down. So always check for free rotation. I made a bracket to hold the transmission at the back, and now everything is nice and stable. Doesn't move much. So now I'll put in the reverse pawl, which goes down in here. And I put in the relief valve here, just doing it tight. I know that it's good because previously I've checked the pressure in the transmission was 85 psi. It's supposed to be 75 to 90. So I still have these to torque up and crimp up the keeper tab. And then I'll put in the rear pump. And the governor on the rear is on the rear pump shaft. That's this. Let's see where it sits when I put it in. This is the counterweight here. So that should turn freely. This valve should move freely. It does. And then the run out, you can either check it on the bench or in the car, as long as you leave in the transmission rather, as long as you leave the cover off. And it's supposed to be 5 thousandths, less than 5 thousandths run out. And I think this was something like 3. Checked it a while ago anyway, it was less than 5. Oh, and then these 4 rings, sealing rings. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, they're all in place. Just to make sure they're not too loose, and they should close up pretty tightly. There's an end gap spec for that. Most of the end gaps are somewhere between 1 and 7. So here's the pump. It's the governor assembly. So that has to be with the fat end towards the rear of the transmission. Slides right in there. Honest. There we go. Here, I'll do those up. So here's the parking pole. The reverse lock, rather, not parking pole. Goes in, the teeth have to mesh with the gear. It's in there. Go that way. And the pin goes in like that. I'll tighten that up, and that should be torqued up the same as these bolts, so 40 foot-pounds. And then it's got a keeper tab. The main cap here is 40 to 50 foot-pounds, so I put it up to 50. Everything rotates nicely. You can see here the governor. You have to rotate the shaft, check the run out, and then the top part can go on after that. 5 thousandths maximum. The Lincoln manual says should be corrected if it's 2 thousandths. That's a little extreme. And GM says 5, so I'm sticking with 5. And this is around 3. Put a little oil in the pump before you put it on. Check for play on the shaft. There's a brass gear inside there, spiral gear. So that's all good. Rotates nicely. Things are ready to go. Put the keepers back on when you do that. So far I haven't found the spec on the clearances in the rear pump. I think that was in the GM manual, so I'll go look at that now. I have checked it previously and it did meet spec. But I would like to relate that number to you. So for the rear pump, between the gear and the body should be 5 thousandths, and the gap between the teeth should be 6 to 12 thousandths of an inch. Hope that helps. So much easier getting the transmission on a stand. Rotate it and move it around. Everything's good. Life is good. So now I'll put the rear servo in. So the band has to hit on the adjustment bolt up front there, and then it has this pivot, and that has to go into a recess in the actuator arm right here. So that's got to go on like that. And these things are miserable to get apart, but you have to take them apart to check them. And there are various specs on the spring and the rings and so on that are inside. And it's common kind of rules for end gap, 1 to 7 for most of them. So now this goes in this way, because you have to have this pin has to actuate it. So there. And these bolts, I'll make sure it sits even when I do that. Now for the front servo. So I've got new rings for it, a new spring for it. And now to check things out. So this spring has a minimum length of 15/16. This one, even though it was in a plastic bag, it's got had a little bit of rust on it. Cleaned that all off. That goes on that cap there, which will go in a minute. Then I have to take the new ring and make sure what kind of end gap it's got in here. And the bigger ring goes in here, and I'll check its end gap. If you're interested, these were hard to find. So this is a SLR from Fatsco anyway. Other vendors seem to have similar numbers. SLR for sealing ring, H104 on their parts list, even though it's H10-4 here. This is another sealing ring, and this one is H14. We call that a piston ring. And even though that certainly looks like a 7 to me, oh yeah, here we go, front servo release. So sealing ring H7-4 or H74. So I'll check I won't leave the camera running, I'll check the end gaps and show you what I find. The H74 is not the ring for this. At least I don't think so. Doesn't look right. Anyway, here's the old ring. I've put the new ring in here to check the gap, and my thinnest feeler gauge is 2 thousandths, and I can't get it in there, so I'm assuming that's okay. Now to get these off and on, you have to spread them. They're cast iron, so you have to be real careful. Let me chase that spring. Caught you. So then you have to pull them up just on the edge, carefully, and then you could take a very fine screwdriver and run it in there, keeping some pressure on, but not much. Just work it around. Eventually it will come off. And now to check the gap in here. My thinnest feeler gauge is tight. So it's slightly less than 2/1000. I'm going to put that on there, feed one end in, and very carefully work it around. Make sure it fits in there. There it is. And that spring goes there. Now this one, yeah, that is definitely not right. I'm not sure what's going on there. I'll have to look further. But this one has one with a stepped gap. So those tend to seal even when they're wearing loose. And that's definitely more than 2/1000, although not much. Pretty tight. Let's try 4. Push it down in the gap. Yeah, that won't fit. So it's somewhere around 3/1000, which is perfectly fine. So now this goes on here. Make sure the holes are clear. Check the shaft for wear. There's a bit there, but we're just polishing. It goes like that. That goes in there. So I'm going to grease all that up. To make sure about that. I don't see any scratching from a spring down in there, so it might not go where I think it goes. So here's the compressed ring, the one that's got the step in it. You can see down there, down by the hole, there's the step. Get my little pointer here, right there. You can see there's not much of a gap there. A little bit, but the step still seals it. So that should be fine. I've greased everything up. I'll put this back on, and this is the tricky bit, to kind of work it in very gently. Again, these are cast iron rings, and they break. And I don't want to have to order another one. So then you can work it in very carefully, and there it is. So now this goes like this. You have the spring there, you have this shoulder cap, you have the large spring, then you have this piston, that goes there, and this goes here. But making sure, of course, that the locating pin is in the correct place for the inner piston. There we go. Now this will go on, and this has to go in. There's the bolt that's the long distance from the piston, and here's the short distance, like that. Now you have to put that on carefully, let it work in. Okay, maybe like this. There we go. So that's in. We have that spring, and then I see the wear ring on it. That piece there, that spring there, down she goes. There it is. Now torque those up, and those are light torque. I think they're 12 to 18 foot-pounds. Might not be that much. I will let you know.
Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, or even notify, or any of the above, or all of the above. Thank you.